Back then, every meal told a story of making do with what little you had. Our grandparents stretched every dollar, turning simple ingredients like cornmeal, potatoes, and beans into warm, filling dishes that brought families together. These meals were born from hard times but seasoned with love, creativity, and resilience. So let us look back and remember 30 cheap meals our grandparents ate during hard times. Back in the day, a pot of cornmeal mush could stretch farther than anyone believed. It started as a humble mix of water, cornmeal, and salt, stirred slowly until thick and smooth. Once cooled, it could be sliced and fried in a cast iron pan until golden brown and crisp at the edges. Drizzled with syrup or honey, it became a sweet, hearty breakfast that cost next to nothing but tasted like comfort. Families relied on it because it filled hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It was simple, satisfying, and a reminder that food did not need to be fancy to be good. And when breakfast was done, there was always something else waiting for the skillet, like the creamy, salty dish that came next. Creamed chipped beef on toast, or as soldiers called it, SOS, was another staple that turned scarcity into a meal. Made from dried beef, mixed with flour, milk, and a bit of butter, it was ladled over toasted bread to create a stick-to-your-ribs dish that could feed an army. It became a favorite in military kitchens and Depression-era homes alike, offering warmth and sustenance when times were tough. And just like that, the smell of frying potatoes was never far behind. Potato pancakes were the true symbol of thrift. Nothing went to waste. Leftover mashed potatoes were mixed with a little flour, egg, and onion, then pressed flat and fried until crispy on the outside and soft inside. Served with applesauce, sour cream, or just a pinch of salt, they were a simple pleasure that tasted far richer than they cost. Every bite was proof that waste was not an option, and that creativity could turn scraps into something special. And speaking of simple greens turned into gold. Dandelion greens with vinegar were a taste of spring that came straight from the yard. When money was scarce, people picked these wild greens, boiled them down, and dressed them with vinegar or bacon drippings. They were slightly bitter, tangy, and full of nutrients at a time when every vitamin mattered. Some folks saw weeds, others saw dinner. It was a meal born from the land and from wisdom passed down through generations. And when the garden was bare, there was always one pot simmering on the stove, the one filled with beans and salt pork. Beans and salt pork stew was a Depression-era classic that could last for days. Just a handful of dried beans, a small piece of pork, and hours of slow simmering created a pot of rich, smoky comfort. The aroma filled the whole house, drawing everyone to the table with the promise of warmth and flavor. Served with a hunk of cornbread or a simple biscuit, it was the definition of making something out of nothing. But if you thought beans were thrifty, wait until you see how far a handful of macaroni could go next. Macaroni and canned tomatoes was one of those meals that proved you could make magic from a nearly empty pantry. A single can of tomatoes, a bit of elbow macaroni, and a dab of butter could feed an entire family. The tang of the tomatoes mixed with the soft noodles made a dish that was both hearty and humble. Some added a sprinkle of sugar to cut the acidity, while others tossed in onions or whatever seasoning they had left. It was a true Depression-era favorite, simple, filling, and cheap enough to stretch for multiple meals. Every pot told the same story. When times got hard, people got creative. And when the day ended and money was gone, there was still one meal that brought comfort in its simplest form. Bread and milk supper was as plain as it sounds, but to many families it meant warmth and safety at the end of a long day. All it took was a bowl, some torn-up bread, and milk poured over the top, sometimes sweetened with sugar or cinnamon, other times left plain. It was soft, soothing, and easy to make when cupboards were bare. To children growing up in the 30s and 40s, it felt like dessert, even when it was dinner. And speaking of sweet simplicity, the next dish took breakfast to a whole new level of comfort. Fried cornmeal cakes, better known as Johnny cakes, were the ultimate frontier food that never went away. Made from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, they were fried on a hot griddle until golden brown and crisp at the edges. Served with butter, syrup, or even gravy, they were cheap, hearty, and versatile. Some families made them sweet, others savory, but everyone agreed they hit the spot. Johnny cakes were proof that the simplest recipes often lasted the longest. And while cornmeal fed many, others turned to even humbler ingredients to get through the day, like onions and lard. Onion and lard sandwiches were born from pure necessity. With meat too expensive to buy, families used what they had. Thick slices of onion spread with a bit of lard on plain bread. The lard added richness, and the onion brought sharp flavor that cut through the fat. It was not fancy, but it filled the stomach when little else could. For many, it became a symbol of pride and perseverance during the hardest years. Every bite was a reminder that survival sometimes meant eating what others would not. But when paychecks started to return and frying pans came back out, one meal became the king of cheap comfort food. Fried bologna with potatoes was a classic working man's meal that never truly disappeared. Bologna was cheap, salty, and satisfying, especially when browned in a hot skillet until the edges curled up. Toss in a pile of fried potatoes on the side, and you had dinner that could stretch for the whole family. Some added onions or ketchup, others kept it plain, but it was always a crowd pleaser. It tasted like home. The smell alone could fill a kitchen with nostalgia. And just when you thought the pantry was empty, another simple meal was waiting, one that started with nothing more than rice and raisins. Rice and raisins with sugar was a sweet reminder that dessert did not have to be fancy. When cupboards were bare, a pot of rice could do double duty, first as dinner, then as a simple sugary comfort. Warm rice mixed with a handful of raisins, a spoonful of sugar, and a splash of milk became a treat that felt like a hug on a cold night. Some families added cinnamon, others just used what they had, but it always tasted like home. It was cheap, filling, and loved by children who did not know what poor meant, only that supper was sweet that night. And while rice offered comfort, the next dish brought real warmth from the stovetop, straight out of Eastern European immigrant kitchens that helped shape America's table. Cabbage and noodles, often called haluski, was a simple skillet meal that stretched every ingredient to its limit. With butter, onion, and a head of cabbage, a family could create a dinner that was hearty and satisfying. The soft noodles soaked up the flavors while the cabbage turned tender and sweet as it cooked. Sometimes bits of bacon or ham were added if there was any to spare, but it was just as tasty without. It was peasant food in the best way, humble, delicious, and reliable. And when the cabbage pot was empty, the next meal waiting was one just as honest, made with beans and cornbread straight from the skillet. Hot water cornbread and pinto beans were the soul of Southern survival, made from cornmeal mixed with boiling water and fried until crisp. This bread required no eggs, milk, or fancy ingredients. Paired with a pot of slow-cooked pinto beans, seasoned with salt pork or even just salt, it was a complete meal that fed entire families. The beans offered protein, the cornbread brought comfort, and together they represented everything that was right about simple food. The smell of it cooking could fill a house with hope. And when the beans were gone, there was always another way to stretch breakfast into dinner, especially if you had a few eggs to spare. Egg gravy over biscuits might sound unusual today, but during hard times, it was a clever and hearty way to make breakfast last all day. A few scrambled eggs cooked down in milk and flour turned into a creamy gravy that poured perfectly over fresh biscuits or stale bread. It was rich, filling, and comforting, all from ingredients most families already had on hand. It was not about extravagance. It was about making every egg count. That golden gravy warmed more than stomachs. It warmed spirits, And when the last biscuit was gone, the next meal came from something even humbler: the trusty potato. Potato soup with onions and butter was as simple as it sounds, but for many families it was a lifeline. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and available all year round. Simmered with onions and a bit of butter, they transformed into a thick, soothing soup that could feed a crowd. Sometimes milk or flour was added for creaminess, but it was never fancy, just good, honest food. It brought everyone to the table, spoon in hand, grateful for what little they had. And when the soup pot was scraped clean, there was always one more way to make something out of nothing, like turning oatmeal into a warm, hearty dinner. Oatmeal dinner with fried apples was the kind of meal that turned hardship into comfort. Most people today think of oatmeal as breakfast, but during the Depression, it showed up on the supper table too. Oats were cheap, hearty, and easy to stretch, and when paired with a pan of fried apples, they felt downright luxurious. The sweetness of the apples caramelizing in butter mixed perfectly with the warm, creamy oats. Sometimes a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon was all that was needed to make it feel special. It was a simple dish, but one that filled stomachs and hearts alike. And just when you thought you had run out of fresh fruit, the next meal made something wonderful out of nothing more than canned tomatoes and a bit of flour. Tomato gravy on rice or bread was born out of pure necessity. When there was no meat for dinner, a can of tomatoes could save the day. Cooked down with butter, flour, and a pinch of sugar, it turned into a rich, tangy gravy that could transform plain rice or stale bread into a satisfying meal. The smell of simmering tomatoes filled the kitchen with warmth, and the taste lingered long after the last bite. It was poor man's comfort food at its best, full of flavor and love. And if there were any leftovers from the night before, nothing went to waste, because that meant one thing: hash. Leftover meatloaf hash was the ultimate reinvention of yesterday's dinner. A slice of cold meatloaf, chopped and fried with potatoes and onions, turned into something entirely new. It was crispy, savory, and hearty, the kind of meal that made you forget it had started as leftovers. Served with an egg on top or a bit of ketchup on the side, it made sure not a single crumb went to waste. Every Depression-era kitchen knew how to make food last, and this was proof of it. And when meat was not on the table at all, there was always a pot of creamy corn chowder bubbling away. Corn chowder with saltines was a humble dish that stretched summer's bounty far into winter. Made from corn, milk, onions, and potatoes, it was thick, filling, and comforting. When there was no milk, folks used water and thickened it with flour instead. A handful of saltine crackers crumbled over the top added just the right crunch. It was sweet, savory, and simple, the kind of meal that made you forget how little you had. And when there were a few potatoes left over, even they would find new life the next day in a hot frying pan. Fried mashed potato patties were a thrifty cook's secret weapon. Made from leftover mashed potatoes mixed with an egg and a bit of flour, they were shaped into patties and fried until golden brown. Crispy on the outside and soft inside, they could be eaten plain or topped with a bit of butter or gravy. It was one of those meals that proved nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Every bite tasted like home and ingenuity. And when those potatoes were gone, there was always another simple dish waiting, one that started with a chicken bone and turned into a pot of comfort. Homemade noodle soup with chicken scraps was the heart and soul of Depression-era cooking. Nothing went to waste, not even the tiniest bone or leftover shred of meat. A few chicken scraps simmered for hours in a pot of water became a flavorful broth, often enriched with onions, carrots, and celery if they were on hand. The real magic came when homemade noodles were dropped in, simple strips made from flour, eggs, and a bit of elbow grease. It was more than soup. It was a symbol of hope and resourcefulness, a reminder that love could stretch even the smallest meal into something meaningful. And when the soup pot was finally scraped clean, another cheap but comforting dish waited, one built on beans and toast. Baked beans on toast was a dish borrowed from across the ocean, but made entirely American by thrift. A can of baked beans could feed an entire family when poured over slices of toasted bread. The sweetness of the beans mixed with the crunch of the toast created a meal that was both filling and satisfying. Sometimes a sprinkle of onion or a slice of bacon dressed it up, but it was good even in its simplest form. It became a staple in households where every penny mattered, and when canned meat was added to the mix, it turned into something heartier: the unforgettable flavor of fried cabbage and Spam. Spam and fried cabbage skillet was the working-class answer to a one-pan dinner. Spam was cheap, salty, and lasted forever on the shelf, a true Depression and wartime staple. Fried together with cabbage and onions, it made a meal that was both fragrant and filling. The sizzling of Spam in a hot pan was the sound of dinner being saved once again. Even when times were tough, this dish could make a table feel full. And when there was no meat, people still found ways to make something sweet, even without fruit or sugar to spare. Vinegar pie and mock apple pie were Depression-era miracles. When apples were too expensive, vinegar mimicked their tartness in a pie filling made from pantry staples like sugar, butter, and a splash of spice. For mock apple pie, crackers replaced the fruit entirely, baked with syrup, cinnamon, and lemon juice until no one could tell the difference. These pies were triumphs of ingenuity, proof that dessert was not a luxury, but a necessity of spirit. They reminded families that even in hard times, sweetness could still be found. And when the last crumb was gone, there was one more way to end a tough day, with a bowl of pudding that turned spoiled milk into something wonderful. Rice pudding made from old milk was the true taste of thrift. When milk began to sour, it was not thrown out. It was cooked into something comforting and rich. Mixed with rice, sugar, and a hint of vanilla or cinnamon, it transformed into a creamy dessert that stretched the last bit of food in the house into one more meal. Sometimes raisins were added, sometimes not, but it always tasted like a blessing. Every spoonful was a reminder that waste had no place in a wise kitchen. And when the pudding cooled, there was always another creative dish waiting, one that turned leftover dough into a poor man's donut. When there wasn't enough money for a bakery treat, families made their own, out of nothing more than leftover dough, oil, and a bit of sugar. Fried bread dough, often called poor man's donuts, was born from necessity, but loved for its simplicity. A lump of dough, fried until golden and sprinkled with sugar, tasted just as good as anything store-bought. The crispy outside, soft inside, and that sweet coating made every bite feel like a small luxury in a world of hardship. Kids waited eagerly by the stove, eyes wide as the sizzling dough filled the kitchen with warmth and hope. Even in times when treats were rare, these humble donuts made everyone smile, and once the sugar settled, it was back to hearty comfort in the form of a big pot of cabbage stew bubbling away on the stove. Cabbage stew was the kind of meal that filled both bellies and hearts. It was the ultimate poor man's supper, built from garden vegetables and scraps that could stretch for days. Chopped cabbage, carrots, potatoes, and maybe a small piece of ham bone simmered together into a rich, earthy broth that brought the whole family to the table. The longer it cooked, the better it tasted, each ingredient melting into the next. For many, this stew was a symbol of survival, proof that even in lean years you could make something nourishing out of nearly nothing. And when the pot ran low, the next meal would often come from the same spirit of resourcefulness, a sizzling skillet of corned beef and potatoes. Corned beef hash was the king of leftovers, a dish born from yesterday's scraps and today's hunger. Chopped potatoes, onions, and bits of corned beef were fried together until crisp and golden, creating that unmistakable savory smell that filled a kitchen with comfort. Sometimes an egg was cracked on top for extra richness, sometimes not. but it never failed to satisfy. It was hearty, simple, and stretched a can of meat as far as possible. For many, it became a Sunday breakfast tradition, even long after the hard years passed. But when meat wasn't available, families found a way to make something just as warm and comforting, with a handful of peas and a slice of toast. Creamed peas on toast was one of those humble dishes that tasted far richer than it looked. A white sauce made from milk, butter, and flour poured over tender peas transformed the simplest pantry ingredients into a filling meal. Served over toasted bread, it was creamy, sweet, and surprisingly satisfying. It reminded people that comfort didn't have to come from meat. Sometimes it came from a little milk and a lot of creativity. It was the kind of meal you could eat while the radio played softly in the background, a quiet reminder of how resourceful families could be. And when breakfast time rolled around again, there was another way to turn leftovers into gold, with an egg and a few potatoes. The egg and potato scramble was a Depression-era breakfast that worked just as well for dinner. It started with diced leftover potatoes fried in a bit of grease until crispy, then mixed with a couple of beaten eggs, enough to make a hearty meal for the whole family. Sometimes onions or bits of bacon were added if they were available, but even plain, it was golden, filling, and full of flavor. This dish captured the essence of the times: make do, waste nothing, and feed everyone. The smell of frying potatoes in the morning meant a new day was beginning, one filled with simple food, hard work, and gratitude. And though times have changed, the spirit behind meals like this still lingers, reminding us how our grandparents made something beautiful out of so little. Hard times may have shaped these meals, but the love and creativity behind them are what truly fed families through the years. If this trip down memory lane brought back warm memories, share your favorite old-fashioned dish in the comments, give this video a like, and make sure to subscribe for more stories from the good old days.